The perfect family, it turns out, is a beautiful fiction, a carefully staged photograph hiding a truth so monstrous it can only be whispered. This is the story of that photograph, of the smile that masked a killer, and of a victim whose final, desperate prayer for a single, simple act of mercy was met with a judge's unthinkable reply. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, gnawing dread in a picture-perfect North Carolina town. It was a place where front porches were for swinging, not for suspicion, and where the American dream was supposed to be a promise, not a prelude to a nightmare. At the center of this dream was Lynn Keene, a woman whose warmth was as constant as the southern sun. To her friends and family, Lynn was the bedrock, a devoted mother to her 2 daughters, a loyal friend who never forgot a birthday, and a woman of profound, unshakable faith. She found joy in the simple rhythms of life, tending her garden, singing in the church choir, and filling her home with the smell of home-cooked meals. Her life was a testament to hard work and kindness, a quiet triumph over earlier struggles. But every light casts a shadow, and Lynn's was the man she called her husband. Mike Keene was a different creature altogether. Where Lynn was open, he was reserved. Where she was gentle, he possessed a simmering intensity that he kept carefully leashed in public. A former law enforcement officer, he understood the mechanics of authority and control. To the outside world, he was a charming, successful businessman, a pillar of the community. But behind closed doors, that pillar was cracked, supporting a relationship crumbling under the weight of Mike's domineering nature and infidelities. The Keene household, from the outside, was a portrait of suburban bliss. On the inside, it was a gilded cage. The first cracks in the facade began to show in the spring of 2014. The vivacious, resilient Lynn her friends knew began to dim. She seemed anxious, withdrawn, carrying a secret weight that stooped her shoulders. She started making quiet, practical preparations that, in hindsight, were screams for help. She confided in a close friend, her voice a nervous tremor. "If anything ever happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." She updated her will, a document that now felt less like planning and more like a premonition. She was gathering her lifeboats, sensing the coming storm. The storm broke on a seemingly ordinary day. Mike Keene arrived at the local police station, his face a mask of concerned confusion. His wife, he claimed, was missing. She hadn't returned from a walk, he said, and he was worried sick. He presented a narrative of a loving husband frantic with fear. But seasoned detectives know that the story told first is often just that, a story. And almost immediately, the threads of Mike's tale began to unravel. The investigation into Lynn's disappearance was swift and immediately focused. There were no signs of a struggle at their immaculate home, no forced entry, nothing stolen. It was as if Lynn Keene had simply vanished into thin air. But people don't just vanish. Detectives turned their attention to the last person to see her alive, Mike. His timeline was slippery, his alibi full of holes he tried to patch with vague statements and feigned cooperation. He played the part of the grieving husband, but his eyes held a cold calculation that didn't match his words. He was a man who knew how an investigation worked, and he was always one step ahead, a chess player confident in his strategy. The search for Lynn became a race against time, a desperate scramble for a clue, a witness, anything that could pierce the eerie silence Mike had constructed around her disappearance. Then, the break. A tip led investigators to a remote, heavily wooded area, a place of tangled undergrowth and deep shadows. It was there, hidden from the world, that they found her. Lynn Keene's body was discovered, and the peaceful death Mike had perhaps hoped to imply was shattered by the brutal truth. This was no accident. This was a cold, calculated execution. The vibrant, faithful woman had been reduced to evidence, a silent witness to her own murder. The community was rocked, their sense of security shattered. The monster wasn't lurking in a dark alley, he had been living among them, mowing his lawn, shaking hands at the grocery store. The search for a missing person was now a hunt for a killer. All evidence, like iron filings to a magnet, pointed to one man. Mike Keene was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife. The trial that followed was a media sensation, a real-life courtroom drama where the stakes were the ultimate price, justice for a stolen life. The prosecution painted a damning portrait of Mike not as a grieving widower, but as a manipulative, narcissistic predator. They laid out a motive as old as sin, money and freedom. Lynn's updated will, her life insurance policies, Mike's financial troubles, and his extramarital affairs, they formed a powerful mosaic of motive. He had everything to gain from her death and a life of quiet desperation to escape. The forensics, while circumstantial, formed a noose of logic. Cell phone pings placed him near the disposal site. His changing stories were entered into evidence, each new version a testament to his guilt. But the most powerful evidence wasn't a fiber or a fingerprint. It was Lynn herself. Her own words, spoken to friends in those final fearful weeks, were read aloud in the sterile courtroom air. "If anything happens to me, it was Mike." Her voice, from beyond the grave, was the prosecution's star witness. The defense fought back with a strategy of smoke and mirrors. They presented Mike as the victim of a rush to judgment, a man caught in the crosshairs of a circumstantial case. They tried to pick apart the timeline, to suggest other shadowy possibilities. But their case was built on quicksand, unable to bear the weight of the truth. Throughout it all, Mike Keene sat at the defense table, an enigma. He rarely showed emotion, his face a stone mask. He was playing his final, most important role, the wrongly accused man. But the jury wasn't watching the performance. They were listening to the facts. They saw the picture of Lynn, her kind eyes staring out from a photograph, a life full of promise, brutally extinguished. They heard the fear in her premonitions, and they saw the man who had the most to gain from her silence. The deliberation felt endless, a collective holding of breath for an entire community. When the jury filed back in, their faces were unreadable, but their verdict was not. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, a single syllable of monumental consequence. Mike Keene was no longer a suspect or a defendant. He was a convicted murderer. But this story was not over. The conviction was not the climax. It was merely the end of the second act. The true, gut-wrenching drama was reserved for the sentencing hearing. This is where Lynn Keene's final wish would be invoked, and where the judge would deliver a response so shocking it would sear itself into the memory of everyone present. The hearing was a chance for the victim's family to confront the man who had shattered their world. Lynn's daughters, their voices thick with tears, spoke of the immeasurable void left in their lives. They spoke of their mother's unwavering faith, her love, her light. And then they revealed Lynn's last, deeply personal prayer. In the days before her murder, sensing the danger closing in, Lynn had confided her deepest, most heartfelt wish to a friend. It wasn't for wealth or revenge, or even necessarily for her own safety. In a testament to the profound depth of her spirit, Lynn Keene had prayed for one final act of grace. She had asked God that if she were to die, her husband, her potential killer, would not be sentenced to death. She prayed that he would be given life in prison, a chance to find repentance, to seek God's forgiveness before facing his own final judgment. It was a plea for mercy from a heart that had known too little of it, a final, stunning act of Christian forgiveness that took everyone's breath away. The courtroom fell into a hushed, reverent silence as this was revealed. All eyes turned to the judge. The power of life and death, in a literal sense, now rested in his hands. The prosecution argued for the ultimate penalty, stating that the cold, premeditated nature of the crime, the betrayal of trust, and the destruction of a life demanded nothing less. The defense, in a final, desperate plea, invoked Lynn's own wish, holding it up as a reason for leniency. The air was electric, thick with anticipation. The judge, a man charged with upholding the cold letter of the law, now held a divine request in his hands. He listened to the arguments, his face impassive. He had the power to grant Lynn's final prayer, to honor the incredible compassion of a dead woman. Or he could follow the strictures of justice and impose the sentence the state demanded. He cleared his throat, and the entire room leaned forward, waiting for the word that would define this tragedy forever. He looked directly at Mike Keene, the man who had shown no remorse, who had maintained his lie until the very end. The judge's voice was steady, clear, and carried a weight that crushed the last vestiges of hope from the defense table. He acknowledged Lynn's extraordinary plea for mercy. He recognized its profound and heartbreaking nature, and then he did the unthinkable. He rejected it. In a stunning, seismic moment, the judge declared that while Lynn Keene's capacity for forgiveness was a testament to her character, the court had a different duty, a duty to justice. The crime was too heinous, the lack of remorse too complete, the need for societal retribution too great. He then sentenced Mike Keene to death. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The ultimate act of mercy had been met with the ultimate act of judgment. Lynn's final prayer, whispered in fear and faith, was denied by the cold, impartial hand of the law. Mike Keene was led away, his fate sealed, not by a higher power, but by a system that saw his crime as beyond the reach of even a victim's forgiveness. In the end, we are left with the haunting image of two conflicting absolutes: a woman's divine plea for grace and a state's earthly demand for justice. The photograph of the perfect family is gone, replaced by the stark reality of a prison cell and a cold, steel gurney waiting in a distant future. Lynn Keene's story is a chilling reminder that evil often wears a familiar face. And sometimes the most shocking twist isn't the crime itself, but the complex, devastating, and ultimately human struggle between forgiveness and retribution that follows. Her final prayer for mercy was answered with a death sentence. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.